Your addiction to self-sacrifice is ruining your life. And here are 3 steps to how you can reclaim your power, find inner peace, get rid of all the resentment that you hold as a result of years and years of putting other people on a pedestal, making sure that other people's needs are met while neglecting your own. And this often starts in our childhood, whether it's because of the culture that we were raised in. I think a lot of Asiatic cultures, especially, we teach our children to take pride in doing things for other people, and that is one of the most beautiful things that you can do. I certainly believe that there's a time and place for us to put others' needs before our own. But what I'm talking about are actually the more insidious ways that we actually are harming ourselves and in turn causing not only damage within us but also damage to our relationships. So this is actually not at all a good trait, because when we are self-sacrificial, we are perpetuating a cycle of trauma and abuse within our family. This can manifest as anger. Think of an angry father who lashes out when his children does something innocent but inconvenient. Think of it as you becoming more and more resentful because you're giving and giving and giving and you're unable to actually meet your partner's need because you are just so overloaded with other people's problems that you can not take care of the person that is playing the biggest role in your life. It manifests in a lot of different ways. And for me, I've had this epiphany recently where I realized that it is a familial thing that runs in my family, that generation after generation there's this idea of self-sacrifice that's been passed down from my great-grandparents to my grandparents to my parents and now to me. All my life I thought I had to work hard, which is a good thing, but I also believed that I wasn't intrinsically valuable. So I almost destroyed myself trying to accomplish things, not to fulfill a purpose that I had, but to somehow make myself feel better, because 99% of the time I felt like I didn't have any value. And that was precisely the result of my own father and his father and his father before him, who drilled into us this feeling of unworthiness, which wasn't their fault. They didn't know any better, but it's a pattern that I have decided to break in this generation. So here are some of the tips that I have found to be very simple but extremely helpful to help you try and break out of this pattern of self-sacrifice. Tip number 1, the number one thing for me, and you can apply this in your own life, was I stopped doing everything that was harmful. And what do I mean by that? Number 1, I stopped eating things that were so obviously not healthy. It sounds so painfully simple, but as much as we all know that things like sugar, for example, is bad for us, we reach for that chocolate, we reach for that brownie, we reach for an afternoon snack that contains 20 grams of sugar. That is not a dopamine hit. You see, it's something that we are allowing to enter into our physical body that is scientifically proven to be extremely harmful. That includes drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, doing any type of substance that we know in our rational mind that is harmful and that will affect our mood, affect our physical health, affect every single area of our lives, and we still do it. There is just this lack of awareness for all the ways that we are unintentionally harming ourselves. And I am starting with the most physical and the most obvious thing. And so if we can learn to stop doing that, always stop before grabbing that piece of lolly. That is literally the most simple, actually not that simple, because the simple stuff are often the hardest to actually implement, so I wouldn't consider it to be simple, but it is something that I think is the most straightforward to understand. And what it actually requires is for you to be present in each moment and to be using your prefrontal cortex. As we all know, that teenagers don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex, which is why before the age of 25 we do things that we later on regret. All that it is required of you is a moment of why am I doing this? Is this actually loving? Am I actually treating myself with love, with care? Would I do it to a child, would I do it to my child, to someone else's child, to an 8-year-old? And once we acknowledge that, we're able to make conscious choices in our own lives. That's my number one thing, to stop harming yourself. And that is arguably one of the biggest part of being self-sacrificial, is that we are constantly harming ourselves, even when we don't have to, right? So stop being the martyr and make conscious choices in your own life. And my second advice, which is something that came to me while I was actually trying to explain to my parents, because I had this realization and I was trying to kind of make them adopt a similar mindset, which so far has been helpful. My second tip for them, you see, it's so much easier when we give other people advice. My second piece of advice is that you remove yourself from people in your life that is downright unhealthy and toxic. What inspired me to say this is actually anecdote, again, from my family, from my mother and father, who often had friends who were taking advantage of them. Growing up, we had this spare bedroom downstairs. Mom and dad would often have guests come over, friends, they were called friends of my parents, and they would take advantage of us, and at the time it was never obvious to them, otherwise they wouldn't have invited them over, but they were very good at masking and pretending they had the best intentions, that they were reciprocal friend to my parents, but they weren't. As time would tell, that they eventually do something and betray their trust, and it never ended well. But they would always take advantage of them, and every time this happened, my parents would shrug it off and just say, I'm just a magnet. They used to make these excuses and say, oh well, this is just who I am. I'm naturally a magnet for people who are selfish, and because I'm such a kind person. And then it almost flips to them, confirming their self-narrative, confirming their own belief that they are holier than thou, which is why they keep attracting these people that ultimately didn't have their best intention in mind. If you can just consciously distance yourself or remove yourself from people's situations, whether it's a friendship that is no longer serving both parties, whether it's a relationship, a romantic relationship, or even a workplace situation, if you can simply just sit back, reflect on whether or not these relationships in your life are actually healthy. Once you gain that perspective, you need to cut out those people, relationships, and dynamics that are no longer serving you, because if they're not serving you, they're harming you in some ways. And once you're able to have that clarity, you need to remove those influences from your life, because it's only after you do that you are able to stop harming yourself in this sort of interpersonal way. And I think that's something we often forget, because it's more abstract than, say, simply eating something healthy. Cut out any people, any situations in your life that are not healthy for you, and just watch your life transform. And that brings me to my third piece of advice, which is even more abstract in a way. So here there's a pattern here, right? We're going from the most tangible, down-to-earth thing you can do, which is eating healthy, and then we go into interpersonal relationships, which is still sort of tangible. It's something you can touch and feel, and it's people and things and situations. And that brings me to my third piece of advice for you, and that is to stop making negative assumptions. So many of us are guilty for making negative assumptions. Any assumption is inherently bad. We should not be making assumptions to begin with. That's why it's so important to communicate and learn the art of communication with other people in our lives, so that we can remove any chance that we have to misinterpret or misunderstand someone else's intention. But one of the biggest things I think that affected me and affected my family, and affects, I think, a lot of people who have this sort of martyr mentality, is that because we think that we are long-suffering, because we think that we are just always the ones who are meant to suffer, we have this very acutely negative way of viewing the world. It's like you're wearing this negatively geared glasses. You're constantly making assumptions that reaffirms the way you see yourself. And for a lot of immigrant families, it's often, and I'm speaking from my personal experience as a child of immigrants, there's this negative assumption constantly going on growing up in my family that we will never be accepted into local groups because we don't look like those people, or we're from a different culture, and that these white Australians will never like us anyway, so why bother? Kind of unspoken mentality that my parents growing up had. And as a result of having that negatively geared mindset and making those assumptions, of course they didn't end up establishing any sort of positive connection with the community that they were living in, because that was one of the ways they kept harming themselves. Again, going back to doing things that are harmful to us, it was the way that they just continuously made negatively geared assumptions about other people, the way that the world works, and how people are going to treat them, and how they're meant to be treated. And when you already think that no one's gonna like you, of course you're gonna encounter people in situations where that confirms your assumption that other people won't like you. So why make it even harder for yourself? I kind of like to use this metaphor of getting a stage fright before going on stage. If you're a dancer performing on stage, big night, nutcracker, ballerinas, getting really anxious going on stage. Another example, you know you're going in for a surgery and you know it's going to be painful, but you spend 3 days leading up to that surgery suffering needlessly. Why not just stop suffering when you don't have to? And if the pain comes, embrace it and accept that you will go through pain, but don't anticipate pain, don't anticipate suffering. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, great. And that is something I think we do in all aspects of our lives, in all areas of our lives, when we're so negatively geared in our assumptions, is that you already think no one likes you, so of course it's going to be even more painful when that actually happens. And the fact that you think that way makes it almost impossible for you to build healthy relationships and find people who actually from first encounter would appreciate you for who you are. To summarize, my third piece of advice is to stop making negatively geared assumptions, because that is also harmful. We don't think it is because it's a self-defense mechanism, but it is actually extremely, extremely harmful in the long run. It completely hinders us from making healthy connections and encountering people, things, opportunities in our lives that could bring out the best of humanity. It completely hinders our opportunity to have more positive experiences, and that in turn will make it even worse. Thank you again for tuning in. I hope it resonated with you, and this is The Conscious Corner. My name is Nancy. I make videos that empower you and help you live consciously in an increasingly chaotic world.